Okay, so we're going to take a look at the foreign policy from 1921 to 1941. So this is after World War One, and right as the United States gets involved into World War Two. So we're asking the extent to which there was a change in American foreign policy. So on this timeline here, I have a bunch of events. There could be others that you could use, but I want to point out a few things about these events. So first of all, when I look at the change here, one of the changes I see is that in 1932, FDR is elected. Now, FDR is a Democrat, so that kind of represents a shift because before this point, all through the 1920s, you had the presidencies of Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. And they pursued, in addition to their laissez-faire economic policy, they pursued kind of an isolationist foreign policy. During that time, you have these conference, like the Washington Conference, you have the Five Power Pact, the Kellogg-Briand Pact. These are all kind of ways to kind of avoid conflict. Also, remember during this entire time period, the United States is not involved in the League of Nations. So they're not involved in this international organization that is supposed to end disputes. So they're kind of retreating back into themselves, right? This idea of staying out of foreign affairs. So that's the Republican kind of philosophy here is at the 20s and early 30s. When Roosevelt's elected in 1932, in the middle of the Great Depression, his foreign policy also represents a shift. He begins to kind of get involved a little bit more. You have the United States recognizing the country of Soviet Union, which is a communist country. And you think about how radical that is because in this period of the 1920s, the United States was very strongly anti-communist. We had the Red Scare and that sort of thing. And now the United States is saying like, okay, we recognize a communist country in the Soviet Union. Roosevelt also urges the country to get involved in what's happening in Europe with the rise of Hitler and totalitarianism. And so he has this quarantine speech, which he's actually heavily criticized for, saying that the country has kind of a moral responsibility to get involved. And then at Roosevelt's urging, you have the cash and carry policy and lend-lease policy, which were done as part of those are congressional actions, but at the urging of Roosevelt. And also in both of those things, the United States can still say they are neutral now. So that kind of represents a shift. Now, during that same time frame, you have Congress that passes three different neutrality actions, 35, 36, and 37. So the Congress is kind of more reluctant to get involved here. They're kind of continuing on that isolationist foreign policy. So one of the changes I mentioned here was FDR's election, and it goes from Republican isolationism to FDR wanting to be more involved. And then you have the attempts to avoid war, and you have the neutrality acts as ways in which the United States is kind of not getting involved. So one of the continuities we see throughout the time period is, the United States is sort of reluctant to get involved, particularly by Congress. But one of the changes we see is the actions of FDR's president brings the United States more involved into what's happening in Europe. Okay, so a couple of other things here I want to mention. So in the United States in the 1940, the America First Committee, which is an isolationist group of Americans that is opposed to U.S. involvement in Europe, they are definitely an isolationist group, and they were critical of any attempts of the United States to help Europe. Also, the cash and carry and lend-lease policies. These were done at the urging of FDR, and Congress passed these laws, but this was a way to supply Britain with military supplies, because at the time, Hitler had invaded Poland, and by 1940, the Battle of Britain was going on. And so these were both ways for the United States to help supply Britain without actually declaring war or formally aligning themselves with Britain. So cash and carry said that the United States could supply Britain with military supplies as long as, number one, Britain paid cash and Britain picked it up. They carried it across the Atlantic. By 1940, the Lend-Lease Act kind of took away the cash and carry part of things and said, like, okay, Britain doesn't have to pay up front. They just have to pay it back later on. We'll let them borrow it or lend our supplies to them. So that kind of represents a shift from American foreign policy at that point. Okay, so we kind of see how American foreign policy changed, and there was some continuity during this time period as well.